Will there ever be the right time to raise the GST? Hi everyone, there was a request for me to cover the topic on GST, so here goes. I'm going to pitch this for both general public consumption as well as for all economics students. Now, before I get into the specifics, let me also declare upfront that I am neither a PAP supporter nor an opposition party supporter. I am a Singapore supporter, and I am sharing with you my views without any political bias, just based on my knowledge of economics as well as current affairs. There are about three main arguments for raising the GST. So point number one, there are spending needs. So this is quite obvious. We are a rapidly aging population, which means the demand for healthcare is going to skyrocket. And with that, the government spending is going to skyrocket as well. So there is going to be a strain on the government's budget, and thus the government will need to raise tax revenues. So this is one argument for raising the GST. But you may ask, why not raise other taxes? Why not raise income taxes? So that brings me to the second point. Generally, raising income taxes are going to hurt investments, are going to hurt the economy. Because when you raise income taxes, you are essentially reducing the profitability of firms and therefore reducing their incentive to invest, whether local firms or foreign firms. And when investments go down, then economic activity goes down, job opportunities go down. So basically, it will hurt our economy, it will hurt employment. In addition, it is also noteworthy that if you were to jack up personal income tax rates excessively, it can result in a brain drain, especially in an aging population, because the size of the labor force is already shrinking. So if you're going to be reliant on personal income taxes, you are basically going to tax the remaining relatively younger workforce, and some of them are going to look for greener pastures overseas. So brain drain is obviously going to have severe social, economic implications, adverse effects on our country and on our economy. So for these reasons, GST appears to be a better source of tax revenue. Finally, it's probably a better source of tax revenue because it is going to be a more stable and a more secured source of tax revenue. Everyone, one way or another, is going to contribute to GST. Even foreigners, even tourists are going to contribute to the GST. But that's not necessarily true where income taxes are concerned. If the Singapore economy were to face a recession, then you would expect income tax revenues to fall tremendously. Also, again, with an aging population, the income tax base is going to shrink. So that is also going to pose difficulties in securing a stable source of tax revenue. So for all these three reasons, there appear to be strong arguments for the Singapore government raising the GST rates. Now let's consider some of the arguments against raising GST. And there are two main arguments. The first argument is about the adverse effects on the economy related to inflation and also possibly reducing economic growth. Now, for economic students, you should know that raising GST actually first and foremost increases the cost of production to businesses, and essentially it is going to reduce the short-run aggregate supply curve, and that is going to push up price levels, hence contributing to a higher inflation rate, and also going to discourage consumption, which can then reduce the real GDP or the national output, hence reducing economic growth. So, raising GST does have adverse effects on our economy, inflation, and also economic growth. And that is the first argument against raising the GST. The second argument against raising the GST, related to the point about inflation, is the fact that obviously GST increases your cost of living, and in addition, it is known as a regressive tax. A regressive tax is one whereby it disproportionately affects your lower income households, that the lower income households are going to pay, as a proportion of the income, a larger proportion in terms of GST. So with that, it sounds really inequitable because it is going to cause them to be unable to consume as much, perhaps requiring them to reduce even their consumption of necessities. So these are major concerns. These are the two main arguments against raising the GST. Now, however, to be very fair to the Singapore government, we need to also consider the fact that the Singapore government has implemented permanent GST vouchers targeted at the low and middle income households. So these permanent GST vouchers, according to the government, is going to make essentially these households pay 7% or less GST effectively, i.e. the recent GST hikes are not going to have any effect on them. Secondly, for businesses, there are also input credits. So for example, if you were to also buy inputs that require GST payments, then you're able to sort of offset it, okay, with your GST payments, with regards to your GST payments to the government. So I'm not going to go into those exact details. Essentially, there are also other policies that will mitigate the cost impact on businesses. And it is also important to note that at the end of the day, just as we have looked at earlier, if the tax revenue is raised by raising income taxes, then the effects on the economy is going to be worse. So if you ask me from an economics viewpoint, I would say that the raising of the GST appears to be a sound move by the Singapore government. And of course, there are some voices that say this increase in the GST should have been postponed, should not have been done during those years of record high inflation. That's not a wrong idea, but at the same time, will there ever be the right time to raise the GST? I don't think so. This year, we have very low rates of inflation, it seems, so far. But this year is also a great year of uncertainty. The Singapore economy may enter into a recession, and this might continue. The next year, the following year, we don't really know what's going to happen to the global economic environment. So, is this the right time this year when the economy may enter a recession? I don't think so either. So there's probably never the right time to raise the GST. What I think the Singapore government could improve on, though, is to provide all the necessary information to assure Singaporeans of how the permanent GST vouchers work, how they really help lower and middle income households really offset the effects of the GST increase. Especially because when you give a GST voucher, it is sort of invisible, right? It sort of goes into your bank account and it happens like once in a year, and that's not something that we will have on our minds. But the higher prices that we have to pay happens a few times in a day. So psychologically, the implementation of these permanent GST vouchers may not have truly achieved its intended effects. And I think that is an area that the Singapore government could improve on. Having said all that, I think that there is also a great need to explore other sources of revenues. Otherwise, a few years down the road, or maybe 1 decade down the road, the Singapore government is going to call for another increase in GST rates. I think to prevent that from happening, we must already today start looking and start discussing about other possible sources of revenue. And this is something that I will cover in part 2. In fact, many of the suggestions that I will cover in part 2 were already suggestions that I shared publicly and were published in the Straits Times back in 2018. So stay tuned if you would like to find out more in part 2. Ciao.